Hi and good afternoon, or whatever time of day it is for you. Today we're talking about the D780. So this is not going to be an in-depth technical review comparing pixels on this camera with pixels from another camera. This is real world as I found it for the 4 months I've had this now. 4 or 5 weddings and 6 or 10 other shoots. What we're going to talk about is, who's it for? It has some faults. We'll talk about those. It won't take long, but we'll talk about them. Who is it good for? Why this is my wedding camera for 2021, why I've chosen this, I'll explain a bit of the history and what for me makes this really at the moment the only camera I can use. And then we're going to do a completely separate video on AF. I'm going to pop the camera over where you are, we're going to set Dave up, she's gone. We're going to look at Tash, we're going to compare IAF, face detect and that kind of stuff, because one of the big things that people have done is they've been rubbishing the autofocus on the Z cameras. This of course is a mix, I won't call it a hybrid, it's a mix between a traditional DSLR and a mirrorless camera. And the mirrorless camera part of it, the focus, people have been saying, oh, it's not as good as Canon, Sony, I'm here to tell you something different. As someone who actually uses it in real life, has done weddings with it, I think I've done 6,000-7,000 shots on this already. And as someone who's used Sony, a Sony A7 III for 2 years, where I did 70,000 shots, I think it was, this is as good as a Sony when it comes to autofocus and face detect and IAF. We'll look at this later, but for the moment, let's get started. Who's it for? Well, I'm a wedding photographer. I shoot families, some commercial stuff as well on boudoir. It's a general purpose camera. That kind of sounds derogatory, but it's not. It's a camera that will excel, that will be extremely good at most things you ask it to do. If you're a landscape photographer, you'd probably be better with a D850 or a D810, D800, something like that, something with more megapixels, maybe higher resolution. If you're a sports photographer or action, then you'd probably be better with a D4 or a D5. If you're a studio photographer, I'm not sure actually, this would probably be perfectly fine, but you probably want a bit more resolution from a D800 or a D810, maybe even a D850. Or, of course, any of the Z ones that fit into those categories. I say it's a general purpose camera, and that's because as a wedding photographer, I do portraits, I do product shoots, I do a bit of action, I do nighttime photography, I probably almost do something that you call street photography. So I need a camera that is good at everything. And whilst this may not be as good as a D810 for landscape photography, it's going to be 96-7% as good, and it does all of the stuff I want it to. And that is why it's really my choice for weddings. I'm not knocking any of the other cameras. I've never used a D850. I'm sure it's an absolutely wonderful camera, but as a wedding photographer, I don't want 2,000 shots at the end of a long wedding day at 45 megapixels. 24 is plenty for me. That's why I haven't got the D850. The D800 and the D810 I've had a D800 for 2 years. That was my wedding camera. Again, 36 megapixels is a bit on the high side. I much preferred when I came to the D750, which dropped down to 24 megapixels, which was plenty. Processing was faster, less storage, loved it. And also focusing was faster and more accurate. The Z series of cameras, I'll explain when we come to the bottom why I'm using this and not a Z6 II. Faults. This has got a couple of faults. Let me get those out of the way first. First of all, I have a Godox V1 flash. Brilliant, love it. It's a flash, it's the radio transmitter for the off-camera flash. I can just pop it on here, it will control an off-camera flash. It's also obviously on-camera flash. I say I stick it on here, I can't stick it on here. I can, but it won't bloody work. This will only work with Nikon flashes. I can use it on my D700, but I cannot use it on here. You can only use this with Nikon flashes. That is a huge mistake. I don't know why they've done it. It's the only camera in the whole Nikon range that I know of that does that. Why? I've no idea. It's a pain. What else? No battery grip. You cannot fit a vertical grip to put an extra battery in, which means you take portrait shots like this. It's not a problem. I'm really not too fussed. It's not a huge issue. I did use a battery grip on a vertical grip on the D750 when I had that. You get used to using that, but also you get used to taking shots like that. It's not a problem. And if we come on to the advantages in a minute, the battery on this is stunning. Well over 2,000 shots. I can photograph an entire full day's wedding without having an extra battery or two batteries in the grip. So as it stands now with this battery, that's all I need for an entire wedding day. So who's it good for? Well, as I say, for a wedding photographer like myself, even if you're, in quotes, if you think of yourself as a, say, a landscape photographer, then you're still going to get amazing images out of this, and you've got a camera that is very versatile and useful for absolutely everything. I mean, I can't tell you how much I'm impressed with this camera. I absolutely love it. So why is this my camera for 2021 for my weddings? Let me give you a little bit of history briefly. Used Nikon since 2006 or 7, something like that, so a long time. Sorry, Nikon Digital since then. Before that I've switched to Nikon, I think in the early 90s. And so I'm very, very familiar with Nikon. In 2018, the Sony A7 III came out, and that was the first full-frame mirrorless camera that had superb everything. The autofocus was, and still is, pretty much the benchmark to measure other cameras against when it comes to autofocus, face detect and IAF especially. It has great dynamic range, fast burst rates, half decent, reasonably decent video, and so on and so forth. And everyone was saying that mirrorless was the way to go. If you were a professional photographer, especially for weddings well, especially weddings and families and that kind of stuff, you needed to go mirrorless. And I'd been with Nikon for a very long time, and I kind of felt it was time for a change. I went along with all the hype, and at the end of 2018 I sold most of my Nikon gear. I kept the D700 and a couple of lenses, but sold all the rest of it, my D750 that I had at the time, and bought a Sony A7 III. I bought 3 Sigma prime lenses to go with it, the 35, the 50 and the 85. I played around a little bit with a 135 as well, and that's what I used for weddings for 2019, 2020. Obviously last year was a bit quieter than usual, but still did, I think it was 8 or 10 weddings. Got towards the end of last year, and I'd never fallen in love with the Sony. Let me explain. Photography for me, it's my business, but I do it because I'm passionate about it. I love photography and I love creating great photos, or at least as good as I possibly can. And when I got the Sony and started taking some shots with it, I was immediately disappointed, because there's a disconnect between what I thought I saw up here and what I actually saw in the back of the camera. When you take a shot, you look out there and you kind of compose it. You think about the light. You come up, you take the shot, and you look at the back of the camera. And on a Nikon, it's, well, certainly on this one, it's better, if anything, than what's out there. It's more artistic. It's got more depth. I don't know what they put on the sensor, but it must be some fairy dust or something like that, because it actually makes the shot better. With the Sony, I looked at the back of the camera, and it wasn't what I expected to see. It was too sharp, it was too contrasty, it was too vibrant, the colours were oversaturated. It was, and of course you can play with the settings, and you can turn it into black and white if you want to. But what I mean is that if you took the standard setting, imported that into Lightroom, it was the same in Lightroom. It was overdone. It looked like a smartphone photo. I didn't like it. It didn't have the feeling, the artistry that I was used to with Nikon. The other problem was the lenses. I've got a 50mm lens on here. This is a 1.8. I'll explain maybe later on why I've got this on there, and not a 1.4. But the 50mm lens on the Sony was probably more like that side. In fact, that's obviously a lens hood. It was actually that long for the actual lens plus a lens hood. It was probably about that long, and that's a 50mm lens. The 135, I mean, that was absolutely massive. And you've got this lens on there, and you've got this body which is much smaller than this, and you're carrying that around for the whole day, and it really gets wearing. I mean, with this lens, I can shoot that easily, one-handed. It's very comfortable. There is no problem at all. I can sometimes I hold a flash in this hand or a reflector, and I can still get the shot. I can reach all the dials, controls, buttons, and I can get the shot. Couldn't do it with Sony. It was just not. It didn't have the ergonomics. It didn't have the user friendliness that these guys have. So, long story. I won't rubbish the Sony anymore. It's basically a good camera, but it's just not for me. And so at the end of 2000 and where are we now? 20. Decided I was going to go back to Nikon. So I sold all my Sony gear. What Nikon am I going to buy? I didn't want to go back to the D750 because that's what I had 2 years before that, and that kind of seemed a bit of a backward step. Didn't want the D850, as I said, because of basically too much resolution. So looked seriously at the Z series of cameras, which by 5 months ago, the Z6 II was just coming out, I think then. The Z6 had a major update, so the autofocus was much better. But there's a problem. I like D lenses. This is an 85 1.4D. That's a 135 f2D. That's a zoom 18 to 35 zoom D. That's a 35 f2D. That is my only G lens, although even that looks like a D. It's a retro styled G lens, and the reason I've got one G lens is that it's got an internal focusing motor. This has got focus stacking, which requires a lens with an internal focus motor if I ever want to use focus stacking, and I do other shots as well. I've got a website where I sell prints. It may come in useful for that. And of course, using D lenses, which by the way are typically a half to 2/3 the price of an equivalent G lens, means that I can't use any Z series cameras. They wouldn't focus. I wouldn't have autofocus. By the way, I've forgotten. D lenses made in Japan, made of metal. G lenses made in China, made of plastic. I'll just mention that. That's another reason why I love the D lenses. These lenses I can have for the next 20 years and they will still work perfectly. The G lenses, I'm not quite so sure that they'll be perfect in 20 years time. So I couldn't use the Z series of cameras, which meant I was really used to using eye and face detect on the Sony, and I didn't really want to give that up completely. D780, I've got that on the rear screen in live view. I've got a D750 through the viewfinder. I've got a mix of both cameras. I've got video capability. I do short clips during weddings, nothing particularly clever, but it's still really easy. I just switch that button, I just put it in live view, switch from stills to video, and I've got a video camera. There's no even twisting dials or going into menus or anything else. It is really brilliant. So let me just sum up. I've been rabbiting on. Let me just sum up and try and be concise. I'll try. What I love about it, it's ergonomics. It is beautiful to hold. It really is. Everything's in the right place. Everything works quickly. It's intuitive. The menu system is brilliant. You've got separate menus for still photography and video. You can set them all up differently. You've got separate functions that work as the still camera on live view and the OVF. So I can have a different focusing mode in live view to what I've got in the OVF. It just mixes two cameras perfectly. It really does work very well indeed. The pictures are absolutely stunning. They are, I would say they're slightly, I was going to say better than the D750. They're probably not better. They're possibly, are they sharper? No, they're probably not. They're probably about the same. But getting the picture is a little bit easier with this. The AF through the OVF is probably a tiny bit quicker than the D750. I can remember on the D750 I used to occasionally miss a shot out of focus. The exposure used to be slightly off here and there. With this, as I say, I've done 4 or 5 weddings, so and 4,000 or 5,000 shots. I can honestly say I probably got 3 or 4 shots that are out of focus, and probably the same where the exposure is off by more than a stop. So it is very, very accurate, which at a wedding is great, because the shot that is completely underexposed and useless is the shot that you really wanted to have. So it's great. 2 card slots, obviously, huge battery life, lovely screen, nice and flippy to get low down shots or high up shots. What else? No flash, no pop-up flash, which actually I see as an advantage. It just means it's a bit more waterproof, a bit more robust if I drop this. And seriously, this is so well made. I reckon I could drop this on the floor. I'm not going to. And it wouldn't do any damage whatsoever. It's built like a tank. And this, combined with the D lenses, which to my eye are more pleasing images than the G lenses. They focus just as sharp, as you'll see in a moment when we do the autofocus test. They're just as quick, just as sharp, but a little bit more artistic. That's just my view. Let's get on to the AF test and see that this is the match of any camera out there, in my view. Okay, so here's the setup for the face detect and IAF. We're looking at my very small office, and I've set up Steve on the tailor's dummy, and also Tash off to the left there. So let's turn the camera on, and obviously we go into live view, and I'll now focus in. Now you've got the scene, I'll focus in on the camera. And you can see that instantly it's picked up Steve's left eye. Sorry, right eye. And we're comparing this to a Sony A7 III, which is kind of the standard for face detect, IAF and that kind of thing. I used the Sony for 2 years myself. Must have taken, what did I do, 30 weddings, so all in all about 70,000 shots in 2 years. So I did get to know the Sony pretty well. And people say that the Nikon isn't as good as the Sony. And they're talking about the Z6 II or the Z6 with the update. They're still saying that the AF isn't as good as other cameras. And the Sony A7 III is kind of the benchmark for AF. So I'm comparing what we're seeing on the back of the screen here on the D780 to a Sony A7 III, which I know very well. And the Sony A7 III wasn't perfect. I actually had to have two buttons set for my wedding photography. One AF button was using face detect, IAF and that kind of stuff, which was great. I then had to have a second button set up for normal focus, just a small, I suppose you'd call it sort of spot focus, single point focus. It was actually a tiny box, which I could move around the screen. Because on the Sony, if you picked up someone's face and that person wasn't the person you wanted the AF to focus on, you could not make the damn thing switch to another face. So what I had to do was use the other focus button, the normal focus button, click that, get that over the person's face, focus normally on that, then push the face detect focus button, and that would then focus on that person's face. As you can imagine, when the bride is walking up the aisle with her father and you want a shot of her father in focus and not the bride, by the time you've done all that, the guys are halfway up the aisle. So it wasn't perfect by any means. So why people are saying that the Nikon AF system isn't as good as other people, I cannot understand. Because, let me show you. We're focused on Steve's right eye, and if I just press the button there, we've now focused on his left eye. So if I want real shallow depth of field, I wouldn't from this distance, it wouldn't really make any difference. But it's there if you want it. And I mean, he's some distance away. His face is very small in the whole frame, and it's still picking up his eye. That is plenty close enough, even for a 1.4 lens with a really shallow depth of field. At this distance, IAF is actually pretty useless because both eyes are going to be in focus anyway. However, you've got it, so there's no argument there. But now, suppose I want to focus on Tash. With the Sony, as I say, I would now have to press another button, put the focus spot over her, focus, go back to the other button, and then, not always, but then 85–90% of the time, face detect would pick up her face and not Steve's. On the Nikon, I simply press the left button, go to his eye, and press that button, and it goes to her face. And that's what it's focused on. I don't get it, guys. Why are people saying that the Nikon AF isn't as good as other cameras? It is stunningly good. And I can simply switch back to Steve if I want to whichever eye I want to. Tracking is amazing. I mean, it's keeping up with Steve. If I go back to Tash, it's staying on her. It's brilliant. It's going to be so much better. I mean, I've done a few weddings with this, and I can tell you it is better from my point of view as a wedding camera than the Sony was. If we now talk about non-face or IAF, press the OK button. I get the centre box up. I can move it if I want to, but actually I don't need to. Sorry, let me cancel that. Right, so from IAF, I simply press the OK button. We get the centre tracking box up. I can put that over Steve's face. And as I say, if Steve was a bunch of flowers, I can press the AF on and we track the bunch of flowers, which is actually Steve's face all over the place. This is not using face detect. This is simply 3D tracking. If I wanted to switch to Tash's face, so someone else with a bunch of flowers, then I can again track that. So I don't get it, guys. The AF on this, the live view autofocus, is absolutely brilliant. Okay, so I hope that AF test convinces you. I'm not trying to convince anyone. I'm just trying to redress the imbalance I think that exists in terms of people who have said that the AF on the Z series of cameras, and by implication on this camera, is not as good as other cameras. It is every bit as good as any other camera. I have done a video specifically on AF tracking. If you subscribe and go back through my list of videos, you'll find a video there where I tracked, it was a car, and I used various different focusing mode in both OVF and live view to track, looked at the photos and saw how many were in focus. And basically if you get the mode right, every shot is in focus. It's just, and that's a car doing like 35 miles an hour. So I hope you found that useful. I would love you to subscribe, of course, and hit the bell, and you'll get any new videos that I come up with. And just mention the next video I come up with will probably be a bridal shoot. I've got a bridal shoot in about 10 days that I've organised. I've got a model, bride and groom. We've got hair and makeup. We've got obviously the venue, bride's dress, flowers, and a videographer. So I'm hoping to get a really brilliant shoot on that day. The videographer, hopefully, Rick is going to get some behind the scenes shots. I'll get those and put those together in the video, and just give you a view of how I work with this and what it can actually do. Thank you very much for watching. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye for now.